Have you ever wondered what it sounds like when an empire begins to crack? It isn't a scream. It isn't an explosion. It's usually silence. It's the sound of 1,000 men holding their breath, waiting for a decision that will decide if they live to see another sunrise or if they become just another layer of bones buried in the mud. For 50 years, the Kingdom of Hungary had been that layer of bones. They were the shield of Europe, taking hit after hit, slowly crumbling under the weight of the Ottoman war machine. They were the victims. They were the defenders. They were the ones who bled so the rest of the West could sleep. But in 1595 the silence broke. The dynamic shifted. For the first time in generations, the shield decided to become a sword. The target wasn't just any city. It was a fortress perched like a vulture over the Danube River, a place that had choked the life out of the region for decades. This is the story of the Siege of Esztergom. It isn't a story about glory or waving flags. It is a story about the grinding, mechanical brutality of siege warfare, the terror of isolation, and the moment when the unstoppable force finally met an immovable object. To understand why this specific pile of rocks mattered so much, you have to understand the geography of fear. In the late 16th century, the Danube River wasn't just water. It was the main artery of Europe. It was the highway for food, for gold, for armies, and for disease. If you controlled the river, you controlled the heart rate of the entire continent. And for nearly half a century, the Ottoman Empire had their fingers wrapped tight around that throat. Esztergom sat on the high ground. It stared down at that river with cold indifference. When the Ottomans took it years earlier, they didn't just capture a city, they hammered a spike into the side of the Christian world. From those walls they could see everything. They could tax every boat, sink every supply barge, and launch raids into the countryside whenever they got bored. It was a constant, looming threat. It meant that no one in Vienna, no one in central Hungary, could ever truly relax. As long as the crescent flag flew over those ramparts, the region was in a state of permanent suffocation. For decades, the Habsburg Monarchy and the Hungarian remnants accepted this. They had no choice. Their strategy was purely reactive. If the Ottomans moved, they moved. If the Ottomans attacked, they hid behind their own walls and prayed the stone held. It was a strategy of survival, not victory. They used distance as a shield and rivers as moats, buying time with land and blood. But by the 1590s, the check was coming due. The border wasn't a line anymore, it was a bleeding wound. The defensive system was failing. However, war is rarely static. While the Ottomans looked invincible on a map, the reality on the ground was changing. The empire was overstretched. They were fighting wars on multiple fronts, bleeding men and gold in conflicts thousands of miles away. The main Ottoman field armies, the massive hosts that made kings tremble, were marching elsewhere. Esztergom was strong, yes. Its walls were thick, its guns were heavy. But it was alone. And like a wolf separated from the pack, it was vulnerable. The commanders in Vienna and the Hungarian nobles saw the opening. It was a terrifying realization. To take Esztergom meant abandoning the strategy of safety. It meant marching into the teeth of the enemy. It meant crossing the Danube and picking a fight with the greatest military power on earth. But the alternative was a slow death by strangulation. So the decision was made. They would not just raid. They would not just skirmish. They were going to erase this fortress from the map. Inside Esztergom, the atmosphere began to curdle. You have to imagine what it's like to be a soldier in that garrison. You are hundreds of miles from the heart of your empire. You are surrounded by a hostile population. And suddenly the reports coming in from the scouts stop being routine. They start becoming nightmares. The enemy isn't just patrolling. They are massing. The Ottoman commander didn't need a written declaration of war to know what was coming. He could smell it in the air. The preparations inside the city shifted from maintenance to survival. This is where the glamour of war stripped away, revealing the ugly mechanics underneath. They didn't just polish their swords. They checked the water cisterns, measuring every drop. They counted the grain sacks, calculating exactly how little a man could eat and still have the strength to lift a musket. The walls were inspected inch by inch. Every crack, every loose stone was a potential death sentence. Earth was packed against the masonry to absorb the shock of cannonballs. Timber was stockpiled. Gunpowder was moved from the magazines to the ready positions. The civilians inside, the merchants, the families, the people who just happened to live there, were moved into the deepest cellars. The city began to curl in on itself, like an animal bracing for impact. There was no panic yet. These were veteran soldiers. But there was a heaviness, a tangible weight settling over the garrison. They knew that once the first enemy tent went up outside the walls, the world would shrink down to just the city. There would be no retreat. Across the lines, the Habsburg war machine was grinding into gear. This wasn't a sudden charge. It was a slow, deliberate assembly of violence. Troops were pulled from all over the Holy Roman Empire. You had German infantry, disciplined and grim, men who treated war as a trade. You had Hungarian cavalry, light and fast, driven by a burning need to reclaim their own soil. You had Italian engineers, the masters of geometry and destruction, hired to solve the mathematical problem of how to knock down a wall. Moving an army in 1595 was a logistical horror story. It wasn't just men, it was a moving city of beasts and iron. The artillery trains were the worst. Massive bronze cannons, weighing tons, had to be dragged through mud and over rutted roads by teams of oxen that died from exhaustion. The wagons creaked under the weight of iron balls and black powder. It was slow. It was loud. It was miserable. But it was unstoppable. As they marched east, the mood changed. This wasn't a patrol. The soldiers looked at the size of the siege guns and understood the assignment. They weren't going home in a week. They were marching to a staring contest with death. By early summer, the element of surprise, if there ever was one, was gone. The Ottoman sentries on the high walls of Esztergom could see the dust clouds rising on the horizon. They could see the glitter of armor and the dark shapes of the siege engines. The waiting was over. The arrival of a siege army is a psychological weapon in itself. When the Habsburg forces finally crested the hills and laid eyes on the city, they didn't attack immediately. They just stopped. They set up camp. They dug latrines. They built cooking fires. It was a message. It said, "We are not going anywhere. We live here now. And we will stay here until you are dead or in chains." The first morning of the siege proper began with a deceptive calm. The sun rose over the Danube, burning off the river mist. Inside the city, the garrison was already at their posts. No bugles, no screaming. Just the quiet shuffling of boots on stone and the click of flintlocks being checked for the 100th time. Across the river, the Habsburg artillery crews were awake. They had spent the night sleeping next to their guns like lovers. Then it started. Not with a volley but with a single shot. A test. One cannon roared, spitting smoke and fire. The ball screamed across the water and slammed into the outer stonework of Esztergom. It made a sound like a giant hammer hitting a tombstone, a deep, hollow thud that vibrated through the ground. Dust spilled down the ancient walls. For the people inside, that sound was the end of their old lives. It was the sound of the clock starting. Immediately, the Ottoman gunners responded. They didn't fire blindly. They were professionals. They targeted the exposed crews, the supply wagons, the officers trying to look brave on their horses. The air filled with the acrid, rotten egg smell of black powder. This wasn't a movie battle. It wasn't fast. It was slow, methodical labor. The Habsburg engineers watched the walls through telescopes, analyzing the impact of every shot. They were looking for weak points, for sections of the wall that had been patched up 50 years ago, for mortar that was turning to dust. They focused their fire like a magnifying glass burning a hole in a leaf. Day turned into night, and the rhythm of the siege set in. This is the part of war history often forgets, the sheer boredom of terror. For the defenders, the days became a blur of noise and dust. The walls were being eaten alive. Every hour, another chunk of masonry chipped away. Every hour, the safe zone inside the city got smaller. The civilians huddled in the dark, feeling the ground shake, counting the seconds between the boom of the gun and the crash of the impact. The Ottoman commanders were fighting a battle against entropy. As sections of the wall weakened, they had to plug the gaps with whatever they had: timber, dirt, rubble, even furniture. It was a desperate race. Can we repair the wall faster than they can destroy it? They rationed the food. They rationed the water. They rationed sleep. Exhaustion became a physical weight, heavier than armor. Outside, the attackers had their own problems. Disease began to creep through the camp. Dysentery and fever killed men just as dead as Ottoman bullets. But the supply lines held. The wagons kept coming. The powder kept arriving. The pressure never let up. The Habsburg strategy wasn't to storm the walls and lose 10,000 men in a day. It was to squeeze. To tighten the vice until something snapped. By the third week, the city was unrecognizable. The elegant towers were jagged stumps. The streets near the walls were choked with debris. The defenders were ghosts, hollow-eyed, covered in gray dust, their ears ringing permanently from the concussions. The Habsburg guns had found their mark, a section on the western wall that was crumbling faster than the rest. The engineers nodded to the generals. There. That's the wound. They concentrated everything on that one spot. The air grew thick with iron. The impacts stopped being individual hits and became a continuous hammering. Inside, the Ottomans tried to reinforce it, throwing bodies and earth into the breach, but the physics were against them. Stone has a breaking point. Men have a breaking point. Then it happened. A deep groan of structural failure, louder than the cannons. A massive section of the western ramparts slumped inward. It didn't explode, it just gave up. It slid down into a chaotic ramp of rubble and dust. The breach was open. From the Habsburg lines, the sight of the breach was the signal. The infantry who had been waiting in the trenches, playing dice and praying, stood up. The officers drew their swords, not with a flourish but with grim necessity. The order was given. The assault was brutal. Habsburg soldiers scrambled up the loose scree of the collapsed wall, slipping on shifting stones. Ottoman defenders met them at the top, firing muskets at point-blank range, hacking with sabers, throwing rocks, burning pitch, anything to stop the tide. It was chaotic, bloody, and intimate. Men died screaming in the dust, grappling with enemies they couldn't even see through the smoke. But the breach was too wide. The defenders were too few, too tired, and too hungry. The Ottoman commander looked at the carnage and did the math. He could keep fighting. He could order his men to die to the last man. It would be heroic. It would be legendary. But it would be pointless. The city was lost. The river was lost. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the broken city, the firing started to taper off. The white flag didn't go up with joy, it went up with resignation. Negotiations opened. The silence that followed was heavier than the cannon fire. When the Habsburg troops finally entered the city properly, they didn't march in like golden heroes. They walked in warily, stepping over bodies and rubble. They saw the faces of the defenders, men who looked just like them, just as tired, just as scared, stripped of their weapons but keeping their dignity. The civilians emerged from the cellars, blinking in the sunlight, looking at the ruins of their homes, trying to understand that the world had changed again. The fall of Esztergom wasn't the end of the war. Wars like this don't end with a single siege. But the psychological landscape of Europe had shifted. For 50 years, the Ottomans had been the boogeymen, the unstoppable force of nature that only moved forward. But looking at the broken walls of Esztergom, the Habsburgs realized something crucial. The monster could bleed. The monster could retreat. The river was theirs again. The supply line was cut. The knife was removed from Vienna's throat. We tend to look at history as a series of dates and battles, marks on a timeline. But the Siege of Esztergom was more than that. It was a study in human endurance. It showed that the perceived invincibility of an empire is often just an illusion, held together by stone and fear. When the stone cracks, the fear vanishes. The capture of this fortress didn't bring peace. The long war would drag on, miserable and bloody, for years. But the belief system of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The defenders learned they could attack. The conquerors learned they could lose. And in the grim calculus of war, belief is often the most dangerous weapon of all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the gritty reality of history's forgotten sieges, make sure you hit that like button. It actually helps the channel survive the algorithm. And subscribe if you want to be here for the next time we dismantle an empire, stone by stone. See you in the next one.